Thank you for listening to this podcast today. Gary Zacharias here. It's the Apologist bookshelf. Tim Keller had so many good books, so many wonderful sermons, and you can access those sermons with his website. But one of the books I wanted to cover, and I've done the intro in a previous podcast, is called Counterfeit Gods. And it sounds more theological, but I'd say it's apologetics as well, because what it tells us that there are counterfeit gods out there. We're going to worship something. And he said, the empty promises of money, sex, and power, and the only hope that matters. That's what he's going to be talking about. And I think that's apologetics, because he's going to tell us, don't put your heart in certain areas, put your heart someplace else. And we're going to look at that first chapter today, which talks about something that people have scratched their heads over, and that is Abraham sacrificing Isaac. And some people say that as an example of child abuse, and it's a God who's whimsical. And so there are apologetics natures in there. What kind of God are we worshiping? And so let's take a look. This is chapter 1. It's called All You've Ever Wanted. And he says most people spend their lives trying to make their fondest dreams come true. I mean, after all, we're in America. Aren't we supposed to pursue happiness? And we just search everywhere for acquiring the things that we desire. And we end up sacrificing a lot to achieve them. So he gives a story here. I'm a fan of good stories, and this is a good one, unfortunately. Not a very good ending, but a good point for what he's trying to talk about. He said he and his wife knew a single woman named Anna. She desperately wanted to have kids. So she got married. She didn't think she'd be able to, but she did. She had 2 healthy children, but the dreams did not come true. She had this overpowering drive to give her children a perfect life, so she didn't really enjoy them. She was hovering over them. She had fears and anxieties. She wanted to control everything about their lives so that they would turn out the way she thought they should, and it made the family miserable. The oldest child did poorly in school, had serious emotional problems. The younger child was filled with anger and actually ended up ruining them. So getting her heart's deepest desire probably was the worst thing that ever happened to her. He has another example here, a woman named Cynthia Heimel. In the late 1980s, she wrote, "The minute a person becomes a celebrity is the same minute he or she becomes a monster." And she tells the stories of Hollywood stars that she knew before they became famous. She said they were once just really pleasant human beings, but they've gotten everything they want. They're on the front pages, they're in the magazines, they're in the movies. She says they become supreme beings, and their wrath is awful. And she says their character flaws and their miseries were twice what they were before. So he says, why is that getting our heart's desire can be a disaster? He says, take a look at the book of Romans. In Romans 1, Paul says one of the worst things God can do to someone is to give them over to the desires of their hearts. Why? Well, our hearts take this thing and they turn that desire into an idol. And as Tim says, every human being has to live for something. And if it's not God, it's going to be something else. It'll be some object. And so, as he points out, if we're looking to some created thing to give us meaning, hope, and happiness that only God himself can give, it's going to fail. It's going to break our hearts. And see, to me, that's also apologetics, because somebody may say, well, why should I become a Christian? Everything's going well. I got a wife, got a family, I've got a home, I've got a job. Well, okay, that's fine. But as Tim's pointing out here, whatever we put first, whatever becomes our idol, maybe it's money, maybe it's our job, maybe it's our family, it's going to fail to deliver, and it's going to break our hearts. And so we can talk to that person and say, well, I'm glad things are going well for you, but God is there when things are going well and when things are going badly for you. So we can offer hope that they will have some place to turn to when their life falls apart. So he says there's a quote from somebody, and he doesn't have the list of who it came from, what people, but it said, one Jewish philosopher said, the central principle of the Bible is the rejection of idolatry. So that's one key message of the Bible, rejection of idolatry. Yeah. So he's going to take the story of Abraham and show how that's an illustration. So God comes to Abraham. Now, we know this in Genesis 12. If you obey me, God says, I'll bless all the nations of the earth through Abraham and his descendants. But he's got to leave. So Abraham is told to leave his country. So he's got to leave everything that's familiar to him, friends and family and everything that he was comfortable with. And he goes out into the wilderness. And he was not going to a well-stocked oasis. He wasn't going to a nice metropolis. He was going out in the boonies, way out in the middle of nowhere. So God gave him a new hope, though, in Genesis 12. He said, you'll be blessed. You'll be blessing the world, the nations of the earth, and your offspring. So now offspring means, we're going to have kids. But Sarah, that's Abraham's wife, had been unable to conceive. But God has promised Abraham's going to have a son. Of course, this promise doesn't get fulfilled for a long time. He's finally like 100 years old, and Sarah's over the age of 90. If you see in Genesis 17, then she has a son, Isaac. And so can you imagine how excited they must be? Oh, finally, we have a boy. Now that's what God was telling us about. He's going to bless us through this son. But had he been waiting and sacrificing for God? Did he have God first, or did he have the boy first? Was God just a means to an end? Who's he really giving his heart to? And that's going to be the question, isn't it? So you'd think the birth of Isaac would have been kind of the last chapter of Abraham's life. His faith had triumphed. Ta-da! Now he could die a happy man. But then Abraham gets a shock call from God, who says in Genesis 22, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah, sacrifice him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. Whoa, well, Isaac was now everything to Abraham. Notice he doesn't say take just Isaac. He says your son, your only son who you love. So his affection probably had become adoration. He was putting Isaac ahead of everything, maybe. And so we'll see what happens. Of course, we know that. And Tim says that over the years, people have really objected to the story. They say, well, that sounds like what it's saying is you do something cruel and violent. It's fine as long as you believe it's God's will. And Soren Kierkegaard, philosopher, had a book out called Fear and Trembling. And he says the same thing. He says faith is irrational and absurd. Abraham thought the command made no sense at all, and he contradicted everything else God had said, yet he followed the command. Well, we have to remember, Tim says, that ancient cultures were not living for their own success. They were living for the entire clan. Everybody was part of a family. And there was a law of primogeniture, which said the son, the oldest son, got the majority of the estate. So in ancient times, all the hopes and dreams of a man and his family rested not so much in what they were doing, but in the firstborn son. So here's a call from God to tell Abraham, give up your firstborn. He says it's like telling a surgeon to give up the use of his hands. So it says if you look at cultural background, the Bible repeatedly states because of the Israelites' sinfulness, the lives of their firstborn are automatically forfeit, though they might be redeemed through regular sacrifice or through service possibly at the tabernacle, or maybe through a ransom payment. We see that in Numbers 3. When God brought judgment on Egypt, what did he do? His ultimate punishment was taking the lives of their firstborn. So the firstborns, their lives were forfeit because of the sins of the family and the nation. The firstborn son was the family. So God is saying to Abraham, your son's life is forfeit. It's not an irrational, contradictory statement. God's not asking him to walk over to Isaac's tent and just murder him. The son was going to die for the sins of the family. So Abraham is faced with an ultimate question. Here it is. God is holy. Our sin means that Isaac's life is going to be forfeit. And yet God is a God of grace. He said he wants to bless the world through Isaac. How can God be holy and just and yet still be gracious to fulfill his promise of salvation? See, that's the lesson for us today when we're trying to explain to others what the message is of Jesus and God. We have a holy God, but we have a gracious God. How can he combine those two things? Well, we know the story then. Abraham goes up to the mountain. He said probably didn't know exactly what God would do. But he says in his mind, he's thinking God will do it, but I don't know how. That somehow God would remove the debt on the firstborn and yet still keep the promise of grace. It was not blind faith. Abraham wasn't saying, well, this is crazy. This is murder. I'm going to do it anyway. No, he was saying, I know God is both holy and gracious. I don't know how he's going to be both, but he will. I think that's a really good point. So he goes up that mountain and said the only way he was able to do it was realizing God, yes, God was holy, but he was also loving. So finally they get to the sacrificial site. And it says he put his son there and he reached out his hand to slay him with a knife. But God comes to him, a voice comes to him out of heaven. Abraham, Abraham, do not lay a hand on the boy, for now I know that you fear God. And then he sees a ram caught by its horns in the thicket. So that ram is going to be sacrificed in the place of the son Isaac. What Abraham was able to see that this test was about loving God supremely. And the Lord said, now I know you fear God. Well, as Tim points out in the Bible, that doesn't mean really being afraid of God as being wholeheartedly committed to him. In Psalm 130, it says, the fear of God is increased by an experience of God's grace and forgiveness. So what it's describing is a loving, joyful awe and wonder before the greatness of God. So God is saying to Abraham, I know now that you love me more than anything in the world. That's what the fear of God means. So God knew, of course, that Abraham loved him, but he was putting Abraham through the furnace. It's not hard to see why God was using Isaac as the means for this. If God had not intervened, Abraham would certainly come to love his son more than anything in the world, if he didn't already do so. That would have been idolatry, and that's destructive. So God's rough treatment of Abraham was actually merciful, and we can tell this to people who ask about this. Isaac was a gift to Abraham, but he was not safe to have and to hold until Abraham was willing to put God first. So that's sort of the heart of the story here, isn't it? Abraham takes the journey, and it's only after that that he could love Isaac well and love him wisely. If Isaac had been that main hope, if the whole purpose of Abraham's life, of his joy, was Isaac, then his father would have either over-disciplined him or under-disciplined him because he didn't want his son angry. But he might have overindulged him. He might have become angry and cruel, maybe even violent when his son disappointed him. Idols enslave people. So Abraham's expectations would have driven Isaac away or twisted and disfigured his spirit. So this sacrifice attempt or this trial was important. So this famous incident was also about something, Tim says, that Abraham could not see. Why had Isaac not been sacrificed? Weren't the sins of Abraham and his family still there? Yeah. How could a holy and a just God overlook them? Well, there's a sacrifice there that's a substitute. It's a ram. But was it the ram's blood that took away the debt of the firstborn? No. Many years later, in those same mountains, which I think is fascinating, in those same mountains, another firstborn son was stretched out on the wood to die. But that's Calvary. That's Jesus, the beloved Son of God, cries out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? This time there's no voice from heaven that says, stop it. Instead, God the Father paid the price in silence. Why? Well, the true substitute for Abraham's son was God's only son who died to bear our punishment. Yeah, that's powerful. It says Paul understood the true meaning of Isaac's story when he deliberately applied its language to Jesus. He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, freely give us all things? That's Romans 8. So he said, here's the practical answer to our own idolatries, to the Isaacs that we have in our lives. Now, it may not be our children, could be our job, as we said before, money, home, something else. So it says the practical answer for our own idolatries, which are not spiritually safe to have and to hold, we have to offer them up. We have to keep from clutching them too tightly. We can't be enslaved to them. We can't just sit around mouthing abstractions about how great God is. We have to know that God loves us so much, he cherishes so much, that we can rest our hearts in him for our significance and our security, and for God to handle anything that happens in our life. He says, when the magnitude of what he did, thinking about the real sacrifice God did, when the magnitude of what he did dawns on us, it makes it possible finally to rest our hearts in him rather than in anything else. Jesus alone makes sense of this story. So here's an Old Testament story that actually points to Jesus. The only way that God can be both just, that's like a judge demanding payment for sin, and justifier, providing salvation and grace, is because years later, another father went up another mount called Calvary with his firstborn and offered him there for us all. I thought that was really good. He says we ought to be saying things like, I see that you may be calling me to live my life without something I never thought I could live without. But if I have you, I have the only wealth, health, love, honor, and security I really need and cannot lose. And then Tim wraps up the chapter. As many have learned and later taught, you don't realize Jesus is all you need until Jesus is all you have. Isn't that a good line to think about? I want to read that one again. Many have learned and taught this. He says, you don't realize Jesus is all you need until Jesus is all you have. So there's the first chapter. And I hope it gives you a challenge. And again, I think it really can be seen as an apologetics book because he's talking about the real value of that story, the real point of the story. It wasn't a capricious God that wanted to make Abraham struggle and sweat, and to consider killing his own son sounds so brutal. But of course, we see the real brutality happened much later when God himself went through the ordeal on the cross in his son. Well, thank you for being part of the podcast again today. This is a fairly short book. It's under 200 pages, maybe 170-some pages. And I think it's so important today. Again, it's called The Empty Promises of Money, Sex, and Power. That's the subtitle. And people today, they've put their priorities in those three areas, money, sex, and power. And Keller is showing that will not give ultimate satisfaction. So there's an apologetics. It doesn't say why Christianity is true, but it just says Christianity is something you ought to consider because of what it offers. And then people can say, yeah, but is it true? Then you can launch into apologetics, like looking at the trustworthiness of the Gospels, the life of Jesus, the resurrection, the existence of God, things like that. But this is a good place to start. It's appealing to our hearts. Let's get our hearts squared away. Let's not get caught up in things that are empty and useless, but let's deal with things that matter, that have some heft, have some weight, can hold us when things are bad. And so people would want that, and then we can say, you know what satisfies? Jesus. And we can go from there and explain the story of Jesus. Well, thank you so much for being part of the podcast, and we'll do another one soon. All right, take care.